Hello class, welcome back to Microeconomics YouTube channel. How have you been? So last class we talked about literature review and literature table. So in this particular video we're talking about methodology, we're introducing ourselves to the to chapter 4. Now, like I used to say, this might fall under chapter 3 in your school, or according to your supervisor, your methodology might fall in your chapter 3. It depends. Okay, but whatever happens, how do you write a methodology? Now, methodology is a pretty short, it's one of the shortest chapters of your project, or will be one of the shortest chapters of your project. But a lot of other things you are going to do in your project now depends on how good a methodology is. Now, it's not rare to see students, have to rewrite their methodology chapter, okay, before their supervisor approves it. Okay, so how can you avoid you having to write your methodology, every now and then? Okay, how can you avoid writing it multiple times before you get the approval of your supervisor to carry on with your project? Okay, so now there are important things to note in your methodology chapter. One is, there are deadlines. Okay, so one is your chosen theory. Now this is the chapter where you talk about the theory you've chosen. I must have mentioned during chapter 3, during the literature review, that one of the theories that you reviewed in your one of the theories you reviewed, right, in your theoretical review, aspects or parts of a literature review is what you're going to be using as your theory in chapter 4. Okay, so you talk about your chosen theory, you talk about your model specification, and there are things to note about your model specification. How do you specify a model? Then you talk about your a priori expectations, which is talking about the your theoretical and empirical expectation of the sign and sizes of your independent variables, okay, in relation to your dependent variable. Now you talk about your estimation technique. So what kind of estimation technique are you using? Will you be using the multiple linear regression model? Will you be using a simple linear regression model? Will you be using this model, that model? So what estimation technique are you going to use to estimate your data set? Now we also talk about your source of data. So this section is talking about where you are going to get your data from. Okay, so that's just it. Now, so how do we write all of these things? So let's get to business. And number one, theory. Now, our topic, the one that I've been using as an example so far, is impact of inflation on Nigeria's economic growth. Okay, so what theory am I going to choose? Like I mentioned did I mention it in the previous chapter, in our previous work, or in our previous class, that you have to choose a theory that links economic growth with inflation. Okay, when you have a topic like this, the dependent variable is economic growth. So the theories you have to be reviewing are growth theories, not inflation theories. Okay, of all the growth theories that I must have spoken about, then I think we chose endogenous growth theory. And endogenous growth theory is talking about factors within an economy that aid or foster that country's economic growth. So if there's endogenous growth theory, then there should be exogenous growth theory, which is saying that economies grow based on factors that are outside of it. Okay, but here endogenous growth theory is saying that economies grow based on factors affecting from within. Okay, now so once you are choosing this theory, that's why I wrote justification there. You have to justify it. So why are you choosing this theory? So for me, I'm choosing this theory, because inflation is something that happens within an economy. So and I want to check how it affects, the Nigeria's economic growth. Okay, indigenous growth theory is talking about factors within, and inflation is, a factor within an economy. Okay, and another justification could be that so and so in their studies did the same thing, so I'm just following in their footsteps. All right, it's not as I'm going to write following in their footsteps, right? But I'm just going to state it that other reasons for the usage of this theory is because it was used like that in, let me say, Ola, Chukwudi and Ibube 2019, Busayo, Temiloluwa, 2014. All of just cite some studies that have done the same thing. So you can also listen to your supervisor here. Maybe your supervisor has a better idea, a stronger justification for the use of the theory. So that's why your supervisor is there. One of the reasons why your supervisor is there. So you ask your supervisor, okay, what he or she thinks that you should write as a justification for choosing this theory. You just discuss it out and hopefully be able to get stronger justification if the ones I've listed are not strong enough. All right. So based on endogenous growth theory, economic growth is a function of innovation, the human capital, and other factors that might be from within a country's economy that can affect its economy or that do affect its economic growth. Okay, we are going to fall back to this later on. Now let us go to our model specifications. There are things that you should note about your model specification. You don't just write this is a function of this. No, it doesn't work that way. Your supervisor will likely tell you that your what do I call it? That your model specification should follow theory. Okay, that's why you've used a theory. So your model specification must follow the theory. So that's number one. Then your model specification must follow your research objectives. Number three, for robustness, you have to include 45 variables besides your major independent variable. Okay, our major independent variable in this work is inflation. Okay, so you can't just say economic growth is a function of inflation and then you continue. No, economic growth is a function of inflation. Then you have to include more variables for robustness. All right. Then number four, you have to talk about your APRI expectations. I think I already explained that, right? So now let's pick them one after the other. It must follow theory. I've already explained that. Now growth is a function of innovation and human capital. So it's more or less like I've created a new section here. Okay, 4.1.1 because this is chapter 4 and this is the first thing we're talking about under chapter 4. So 4.1.1, endogenous growth theory and growth model specification. Now I'm already teaching you how to write a chapter 4, so you start like that. So the theory and then your model, you're trying to specify your model. So endogenous growth theory, and because what we are doing here is economic growth is a dependent variable, so that's why I have growth model specification. All right, so endogenous growth theory is EGT, like I use an acronym for it. So according to EGT, normally if it's for you, according to the endogenous growth theory, GDP is a function of innovation and human capital. Okay, that's equation 4.1. So where I represents innovation and HC represents human capital. Okay, for the purpose of this research, okay, the model is augmented to include inflation. Okay, so from there you have GDP then becomes function of I, which is innovation, HC human capital, and INF, which is inflation. That's equation 4.2. Now, for the sake of robustness, two other variables that affect economic growth are then included into the model. Okay, and what are the variables? You have government expenditure on education, then you have government expenditure on health. All right, so GDP is a function of innovation, human capital, inflation, government expenditure on education, government expenditure on health. All right, from there, equation 4.3. You see the way it is moving. All right, so it's like a story. You are telling us, okay, the model includes this variable, this set of independent variables, or this independent variable at the beginning. Then, as you're adding more variables, you have to step by step. You have to tell us why you're telling a story. Now, after that, you then move to econometric form of the model. You want to state it in in an econometric form now. All right, the data that I am using, or the data that I am using hypothetically, is the time series data. So, and because of that, you are going to have the subscript T, okay, attached to the variable. So you have in the econometric form of the model, you have GDP is equal to alpha naught. Okay, you might choose to use beta. Okay, you might choose to use any other form of representation, so any other symbol to represent your coefficients or your parameters. So for me, I'm using alpha. So alpha naught plus alpha 1 IT. Okay, this is talking about the parameter for innovation, plus alpha 2 human capital, plus alpha 3 inflation, plus alpha 4 government expenditure on education, plus alpha 5 government expenditure on health. Now plus the error term, because this is in econometric form plus the error term. So if you are not interested in logging in expressing your data in percentages, or you are not interested in shrinking the size of your data sets. Now, for example, in trying to run this regression, I might discover that these values are in let me say billions, and I don't want to express them in billions because as it is now, if I estimate it, okay, if I perform a regression and the answer gives me, let me say GDPT is equal to let me say 120 plus 0.51 IT. Okay, so that means since I have 0.51 IT, that means a unit, okay, a unit increase in innovation, a unit increase in innovation, okay, is going to lead to 0.5. If I say 0.51 just now, let's say 0.51, it's going to lead to a 0.51 increase in GDP. Okay, a unit increase in innovation is going to lead to 0.51 increase in GDP, because what I have here is plus 0.5, so plus is positive, is going up. Now if I am interested in interpreting my data in percentage form, I want it to be a 1% increase in 1% increase in innovation will lead to so percent increase or decrease depending on the sign here, whether it's plus or minus in economic growth. So that means I have to log my data for me to do a percentage interpretation of of my what do you call it now, of my equation here. Okay, so in that case I'm going to write the log specification of this model. The only difference here that I've added ln. Okay, so you have ln GDPT equals alpha naught plus ln innovation subscript t plus alpha 2 ln this, alpha 3 ln whatever like that. You continue. Okay, and don't log the error term, just leave it that way. So that's about model specification. So here what you then have to talk about is your proxy variables. So I have this as equation this 4.4, so this is equation 4.5. so I'll now begin to talk about the proxy variables for all of the variables in this model. So here GDP is proxied by real GDP data. Okay, well, GDP is proxied by real GDP, real GDP data. Innovation, okay, which is IT, is proxy like a proxy variable. When you're talking about a proxy variable, you're talking about the variable that I can use to measure all of these variables, right? The variable that is closest to them that are measurable, that I can use to measure them. So IT, which is innovation, what can I use to proxy innovation? I talk about patents, number of patents, if there is data on patents, so where patents is used, where number of patents or patents is used to proxy innovation. And if I don't have patents, I can talk about research and development expenditure. Okay, so where innovation is proxied by research and development R&D expenditure data, okay, or variable. All right, human capital is proxied by average life expectancy. Okay, then inflation is proxied by changes in GDP deflator. Government expenditure is proxied by, let's say, public expenditure on education, if that's the name of the data that you have, or if it's government expenditure on the education data that you have, then it's okay. I do the same thing for government expenditure on health. Just look for a variable that is the closest to capturing your variables in your model, and that is measurable, because that is the data they are going to be using to run your regression analysis at the end of the day. So you have to include that. So after writing this, your final model, you understand, or maybe if you're not getting to this point, maybe after writing your econometric model, your econometric form of the model, so you then write your proxy variables, okay, to let everyone understand that these are the variables that you are going to be using to be measuring the variables in your regression model. So your A priori expectations 4.1.2, everything you've been talking about here still falls under section 4.1.1. So in 4.1.2, your APR expectations is now talking about, okay, theoretically and empirically, what are you expecting to be the sign of the coefficients of your regressors, as well as the size? So if you are really sound in economics, so you can talk about the size. Okay, you expect this to significantly affect this. So you think that the size, that is the number be beside each variable, is supposed to be high or low. And when I'm talking about sign, the sign here, when you are done with analyzing your data, when you are done with your regression, do you expect these signs to be positive or negative? Now, if this were positive, it simply means there's a positive relationship between Nigeria's GDP, economic growth, and innovation. Now, if it were negative, that means there's a negative relationship. That is, the more innovation goes up, the less the GDP of Nigeria is going to be. That is, you are not going to be having a positive economic growth. So that's what I'm saying. All right. So here, you look at it. For me, the APR expectations, I expect innovation, to be positively related to GDP, right? So why? Now, when you are given the reason for your APR expectation, you don't just say you expect this to be positively related, you expect this to be negatively related. You have to give, solid reasons, valid reasons why you think so. Now, the thing is, these are your expectations, right? By the time you are done with your regression analysis, your expectation might be correct, your expectation might be incorrect, your expectation might be partially correct. Let me say I want this to be plus, human capital to be plus, I want inflation to be minus, okay, because I think that inflation is negatively affects a country's economic growth in the real sense of it. I want this to be plus to show that government expenditure is positively related to government expenditure on education. Okay, the more they spend on educating the populace, the more the tendency for the country to grow. And the same thing for government health expenditure. So I expect them to be plus. The only one that I expect to be minus is inflation, right? So I might perform my regression at the end of the day, okay, and eventually this might be plus. Human capital might be plus, inflation might be minus, like I expected it, or in fact it might be plus, okay, against what I expected. Then government expenditure on education might be plus, government expenditure on health might be minus. Okay, so that's that. Based on your data and the regression that you've done, that's your result. So one of them or two of them, inflation went against your prior expectations, government expenditure on health went against your prior expectations, your prior expectations. So it's okay in as much as you've done the right thing. Okay, so there must be reasons for that kind of deviation from what you expected, and it might even be that maybe you've not been following through what has been happening empirically, okay, in the country or from the literature. You get to know that inflation over some time now has not been showing a negative relationship with GDP. It has been showing a positive relationship, so it's okay. All right, so what is just there is that at the end of the day, your APR expectation doesn't have to be the deviation from your expectation, and your final result shouldn't be that great, that exceptional. Like, you shouldn't be so wrong. Do you understand? So because that calls for that's suspicious. And you said all of this will be positively related, and your result came out all of them were negatively related. So like 3-4 variables went against your prediction. So that went against your expectation. That's like what's going on, right? So I'm just trying to let you know that your APR expectations may or may not be equal to your final output, but they should be close, right? They should be reasonably close. All right, so I've already spoken about estimating your result already, but now I'm talking about you putting it in order. Okay, so I expect innovation to be closely related to GDP, and why is that? Because innovation leads to the development of technologies that aid efficiency in input use, okay, which means that with the same amount of input, more is produced. And since economic growth is about increase in production, Okay, increase in GDP. All right, and innovation is talking about technology that enables you to produce more with less. So I expect innovation to be positively related to what GDP. So something like that. So it's not like, okay, innovation is positive. Okay, so it's not like the way you're gonna put it. Alpha one, okay, alpha one is expected to be positive because innovation spurs the development of technologies that aid the efficiency in resource use, okay, or in input use, and as a result, um, more is produced with less amount of input, or more is produced with the same amount of input. All right, so that leads to an increase in GDP. I don't know if I'm making sense, so but whatever it is, therefore alpha 1 is expected to be positive. Okay, so not something like alpha 1 is expected to be positive related to with GDP, or alpha 1 is expected to be positive because innovation leads to the creation of um, better products. So like better products. So what is the link between better products and increase in GDP? Okay, so you are not supposed to stop there. What is the link? So you may continue better products that are more affordable, okay, by consumers. So consumers now buy products of improved quality at lower prices. Okay, and since the price of the commodities are lower, the basic law of demand, right? That the lower the price, the more the quantity that is purchased or consumed. So since the products cannot be afforded but at lower prices, consumers can spend more in getting more of the product. So if you want to get more of the product, that simply means that producers would also have to produce more of the products along the line. That leads to economic growth. So you have to be able to link your reason for your a priori expectation, okay, with the objective of the study generally, or you have to be able to link it with your dependent variable. So you don't just state something and go. You have to link it. You have to explain what you are trying to say. Okay, so you do that for everything, for innovation, human capital, and so on and so forth. So that's about that. Now there's one thing I want to talk about before we um, end this particular class, which is talking about objective. So in your model specification, I mentioned something. I said your model must follow your research objective. Now the research objective, for what the example I've been using, if you remember, was something like evaluating the impact of inflation on Nigeria's economic growth. I think that was my research objective, something like that. Evaluating the impact. And what were my research questions? So number one, I was like trying to look for, is there any relationship between inflation and economic growth in Nigeria? Is there any relationship between inflation and economic growth in Nigeria? That's number one. Then the second research question was, to what extent does inflation affect Nigeria's economic growth? So if you look at those questions, they are more or less talking about the a priori expectations. So what they are doing is, this is inflation over here. So to what extent does inflation affect Nigeria's economic growth at all? Okay, that's something like what the first question is talking about. So there we are expecting that we are looking for the sign. We're looking at the sign here. Okay, so when I'm done with this research work, is this sign going to be plus? Is this sign going to be minus? You understand? Or is alpha 3 going to be 0? So if alpha 3 happens to be 0, that is if inflation disappears from my regression model at the end of the day. So that means if inflation should disappear, okay, that means alpha 3 was 0. So 0 multiplied by inflation is 0. So which is telling me that at the end of the day, the study discovered that there is no relationship between GDP and inflation, right? So that has answered the first research question. If this were negative, okay, I've tried to look at, does inflation affect Nigeria's economy? Okay, so from my estimation, that's when I'm done. I'm talking about chapter 5 now, analysis chapter. After I'm done, so now inflation is negatively related with GDP. Now, if this were plus, inflation is positively related with GDP. So that has answered the first question. Now, the second question is saying to what extent. Now, that's talking about the size of this parameter. Okay, so if this were 0.001, that means it's small, right? But if it's let me say 12.2, that's reasonably high. So that has answered the question. All right. So in doing that, And why I'm explaining that is, so I've been able to um, so just putting inflation in this place, okay, when I was specifying my model, then up to this point simply means that no, it is in line with my research objective. My model is in line with my research objective. So there are cases where, because something funny about students is you just keep on writing stuff that you think are great. You don't know the implication of what you're writing until you get to, a different chapter and you are stuck. So what if your objective was not like that?